The cold wind carried the scent of approaching rain as Katherine Jones stood on the dirt road leading into Silver Reef, Utah Territory, her future as uncertain as the darkening sky above. The year was 1879, and she had arrived with nothing but a small valise of belongings, a teaching certificate, and the stubborn determination that had carried her 2,000 miles west from Boston. The silver mining town sprawled before her, its wooden buildings and tents clustered around the main street like mushrooms after a storm, the distant sound of pickaxes striking stone echoing from the nearby hills. Miss Jones. A portly man with a gray streaked beard approached, wiping his hands on his vest. "I'm Mayor Wilson. We've been expecting you. The schoolhouse is ready, though I must say we didn't expect our new teacher to be quite so young," Katherine finished for him, standing straighter. At 22, she was accustomed to people underestimating her. "I assure you, Mr. Wilson, my age has no bearing on my qualifications." The mayor's eyebrows rose, but he gave a curt nod. "Well then, let's get you settled. The boarding house is just down the way." Katherine followed him through the bustling town, aware of the curious stares from miners and townspeople alike. Silver Reef had boomed almost overnight when silver was discovered in the sandstone, drawing prospectors, merchants, and all manner of fortune seekers. It was nothing like the refined streets of Boston, but something about the raw energy of the place stirred her spirit. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house proprietress, was a stern-faced widow who showed Katherine to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6 in the evening," she recited. "No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no alcohol, no coming in after 9 o'clock. You'll find this is a respectable establishment." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." "I'm certain it will suit me perfectly," Katherine replied, though the walls felt as though they were closing in already. She had come west for adventure, for a life beyond the confinement of her parents' expectations, only to find herself bound by new rules. The schoolhouse turned out to be a single-room building at the edge of town, with rough-hewn benches and tables, a battered desk, and a small blackboard. Katherine spent the weekend preparing lessons and familiarizing herself with the space that would become her domain. By Monday morning, she felt ready to face her new pupils, a mix of miners' children and the offspring of shop owners and ranchers from the surrounding area. The children stared at her with wary eyes as she introduced herself. "Good morning. I am Miss Jones, and I'll be your teacher. I expect diligence and respect in this classroom, and in return, I promise to do my utmost to provide you with a proper education." A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Miss Jones, why'd you come all the way from Boston?" "Ain't nobody come to Silver Reef unless they're running from something or looking for silver." Katherine smiled at the child's directness. "I came for the opportunity, Thomas. Sometimes a person needs to see more of the world than what's outside their front door." The days fell into a rhythm. Katherine taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children of varying ages and abilities, breaking up fights between boys at recess, and patiently working with the youngest students on their letters. In the evenings, she would take her supper at the boarding house, then retire to her room to read or write letters home. It was a respectable life, if somewhat lonely. One afternoon, nearly a month after her arrival, the classroom door burst open during a spelling lesson. A man Katherine had never seen before stood in the doorway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There's been an accident at the Christie mine," he announced. "Need help. Doctors looking for folks with strong stomachs to assist." The children began to murmur anxiously, and Katherine quickly regained control of the situation. "Children, you are dismissed for the day. Those whose parents work at the mine, please wait here with me until we have news." After the others had departed, Katherine gathered the remaining children, assuring them as best she could before leading them to the general store where Mrs. Abbott agreed to watch them. Then, gathering her skirts, she hurried toward the doctor's office. Dr. Lewis, a graying man with tired eyes, barely glanced up when she entered. "If you've come to help, there's a basin and soap over there. Wash up, then come with me. We've got men with crush injuries, burns, and one with a face full of rock splinters. Not pretty, miss." Katherine had never considered herself squeamish, but nothing in her genteel upbringing had prepared her for what awaited at the mine entrance. Men lay on makeshift stretchers, some moaning, others eerily silent. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood. She worked mechanically, following the doctor's instructions to clean wounds, hold bandages in place, and offer water to the conscious men. Her hands moved steadily even as her mind reeled at the suffering around her. It was near dusk when she first saw him, a tall man being half-carried by two others. His left eye was covered with a makeshift bandage already soaked through with blood, and his face was streaked with coal dust and sweat. Unlike the other injured, he fought against those helping him. "Let me go, damn it," he growled, his voice low and rough. "There's still men down there. Peterson, you can barely stand," one of the men supporting him argued. "You've done enough. Let the rescue crew handle it now." The injured man, Peterson, staggered as they reached level ground, and Katherine instinctively moved to help steady him. His uncovered right eye, startlingly blue against his dirt-streaked face, fixed on her with suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Miss Jones, the schoolteacher," she replied. "Please sit down so I can look at your eye." "It's nothing," he insisted, but his legs seemed to give way beneath him and he sank onto a crate. "Just some debris. I need to get back. You need to hold still," Katherine interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. She carefully began to remove the crude bandage, wincing at the way the fabric had stuck to the wound. What happened down there? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, his jaw clenched tight against the pain she must be causing him. Then, support beam gave way. "Some of the new timbers weren't cured properly. I saw it starting to crack and got most of the men out, but the last group." His voice trailed off. Katherine worked in silence after that, cleaning the wound as gently as possible. It was deep, a jagged cut that ran from his eyebrow down across his eyelid, with smaller cuts scattered across his cheek. The eye itself appeared intact, but she couldn't be certain. "You'll need stitches," she told him, "and proper medical attention from Dr. Lewis." He turned his head away. "Others need it more, just wrap it up." "Don't be foolish," Katherine admonished. "If it's not treated properly, you could lose the eye entirely." That got his attention. He looked at her again, and she was struck by the intensity in his gaze. "Fine," he conceded, "but after the others." Katherine nodded and applied a clean bandage to the wound. "What's your full name, Mr. Peterson?" "Parker," he corrected. "Parker Blackburn. I'm the foreman at the Christie." 3 men approached before Katherine could respond. "Parker," one of them said, removing his hat. "They found Michaels and Rodriguez. They didn't make it." Parker's face hardened, the muscles in his jaw working. "What about Jenkins?" Still looking. Katherine watched as grief and guilt washed over Parker's face, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Without thinking, she placed a hand on his arm, offering what little comfort she could. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the mine entrance, casting long shadows across the ground. The dead were respectfully covered and moved to the undertakers, while the injured were transported to the doctor's office or their homes. Katherine remained, helping where she could, watching as Parker Blackburn insisted on joining the rescue efforts despite his injury. It was well past midnight when Jenkins was finally brought up, unconscious but alive. Only then did Parker allow himself to be led to Dr. Lewis for treatment, with Katherine following close behind. The doctor looked exhausted but gestured Parker to a chair. "Let's see the damage, doctor." Lewis said, removing the bandage Katherine had applied. He examined the wound carefully, then reached for a bottle of whiskey. "Drink some of this, then I'll clean it properly and stitch it up." Parker took a long swallow from the bottle but didn't flinch as the doctor poured some of the alcohol directly onto the wound. Katherine, standing nearby, couldn't help but admire his stoicism. "The eye itself appears intact," Dr. Lewis announced after a thorough examination, "but this cut is deep. You'll have a scar, and I can't promise your vision won't be affected." Parker nodded once, accepting the prognosis without complaint. "You'll need to keep it clean and bandaged for at least a week," the doctor continued as he began to stitch the wound. "And rest. No going back into that mine for a few days at minimum." "Can't do that, Doc," Parker said flatly. "I'm needed there." You're needed alive and with both eyes functional, Dr. Lewis retorted. Miss Jones, perhaps you can talk some sense into this stubborn fool. I have other patients to see. Left alone with Parker, Katherine found herself at a loss for words. He looked at her, his unbandaged eye reflecting the lamplight. You should go home, Miss Jones, he said quietly. It's late, and this isn't a fitting place for a lady. Katherine bristled at his dismissal. I believe I've proven today that I'm quite capable of handling difficult situations, Mr. Blackburn, and I didn't come west to be sheltered from reality. A hint of a smile touched his lips. No, I don't suppose you did. He stood, swaying slightly. Nevertheless, I can find my own way home. And where is that? Katherine challenged, noticing how unsteady he was on his feet. I have a cabin, outside town. Which you intend to reach how exactly? On foot, in the dark, with one eye bandaged and exhaustion clearly setting in. That seems ill-advised. Parker's expression hardened. I don't need looking after, Miss Jones. Everyone needs looking after sometimes, Mr. Blackburn, she replied softly. Even mine, foreman. Something in her tone must have reached him because his shoulders slumped slightly. There's a cot in the mine office, he conceded. I can sleep there tonight. Then I'll walk you there, Katherine decided, gathering her shawl, to ensure you arrive safely. The night air had turned cold, and Katherine pulled her shawl tighter as they walked through the now quiet town. Parker moved with deliberate care, his tall frame slightly hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. You're new to Silver Reef, he said after a while, breaking the silence between them. I arrived last month, Katherine confirmed, from Boston. Long way to come for a teaching position. It was time for a change, she said simply, unwilling to share the complex tangle of reasons that had driven her west. The mine office was a small wooden structure near the entrance to the Christie. Inside, it was sparsely furnished with a desk, a few chairs, and the promised cot against one wall. A lantern hung from a hook, which Parker lit with practiced movements. Thank you for your assistance today, he said formally, standing by the desk. The men appreciate it. I did very little, Katherine demurred, but I'm glad I could help in some small way. Parker nodded, then winced, raising a hand to his bandaged eye. The movement made him sway, and Katherine stepped forward instinctively to steady him. You should sit down, she advised. I'm fine, he insisted, but allowed her to guide him to the cot. Katherine hesitated, knowing she should leave now that he was safely delivered, but reluctant to abandon him in this state. Is there anything you need before I go? Water? Food? He looked up at her, his uncovered eye reflecting a complexity of emotions she couldn't quite read. You shouldn't be here alone with me, Miss Jones. People talk in small towns. Let them talk, she replied with more bravado than she felt. I'm merely ensuring the well-being of an injured man, which seems a Christian duty to me. A faint smile touched his lips. Always so proper. Has anyone ever told you that you speak like a book, Miss Jones? Frequently, she admitted, returning his smile. My father is a professor of literature. I suppose it's in my blood. Parker seemed about to reply when a knock at the door interrupted them. It was the night watchman, coming to report that all was secure at the mine for the night. He looked surprised to see Katherine but made no comment. I should go, she said after the watchman departed. Mrs. Holloway will be wondering where I am, of course. Parker stood again, steadier this time. Thank you, Miss Jones. Katherine made her way back through the sleeping town, her mind filled with thoughts of Parker Blackburn, his fierce determination, and the look of raw grief on his face when he'd learned of his men's deaths. It was not at all appropriate for a respectable schoolteacher to be so preoccupied with a man she'd just met, especially one as rough-edged as the mine foreman. Yet she couldn't seem to help herself, Mrs. Holloway was waiting up when Katherine arrived at the boarding house, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. It is well past midnight, Miss Jones. This is not Boston with its street lamps and constables. It is dangerous for a woman alone after dark. I apologize for the late hour, Katherine said. I was helping with the injured from the mine accident. The landlady's expression softened slightly. A terrible business. They're saying 5 men dead and a dozen injured. Yes, Katherine confirmed, her throat tightening at the memory. It was. Difficult? Well, get some sleep, Mrs. Holloway advised, her tone gentler now. "You've school in the morning." But sleep proved elusive as Katherine lay in her narrow bed, replaying the events of the day. She had come to Silver Reef seeking a life less constrained than the one mapped out for her in Boston, where her parents had already selected a suitable husband, a colleague of her father's, 30 years her senior, with impeccable academic credentials and a personality as dry as the texts he studied. Teaching in the West had seemed an adventure, a temporary reprieve before inevitably returning to fulfill her familial obligations. Now, however, the thought of returning to Boston felt strangely hollow. There was something compelling about the raw reality of life in Silver Reef, where people faced dangers and hardships with straightforward courage. And there was something particularly compelling about Parker Blackburn, with his intense blue eyes and the quiet authority he commanded. The next morning, Katherine arrived at the schoolhouse earlier than usual, half expecting many of her students to be absent given the previous day's tragedy. To her surprise, most were present, though subdued. She abandoned her planned lessons in favor of allowing the children to express their feelings about the accident, guiding them through a discussion of grief and loss that she hoped would provide some comfort. At midday, as the children were released for their lunch break, Katherine noticed a familiar figure approaching the schoolhouse. Parker Blackburn looked markedly different in daylight, cleaner, for one thing, though still imposing in his height and breadth of shoulder. A fresh white bandage covered his left eye, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. "Mr. Blackburn," she greeted him, stepping outside. "I'm surprised to see you up and about. Dr. Lewis recommended rest, as I recall." "Never been much good at resting," he replied, removing his hat. "I wanted to thank you properly for your help yesterday." "There's no need," Katherine assured him. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," he disagreed. "Most of the ladies in town stayed well away, and with good reason. It was no sight for gentle eyes." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "I may have gentle eyes, Mr. Blackburn, but I assure you they're capable of witnessing the harsher realities of life without permanent damage." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "So it seems. Still, I'm grateful." An awkward silence fell between them, broken when one of Katherine's students came running up, excited to show her a frog he'd caught. After admiring the creature and gently suggesting it might be happier back in the creek, she turned to find Parker watching her with an unreadable expression. "You're good with them," he observed. "The children?" "I enjoy teaching," she replied, "though I must admit the curriculum here is somewhat different from what I was accustomed to in Boston." "I imagine so." He shifted his weight, seeming suddenly uncomfortable. "Miss Jones, I wonder if you might. That is, would you allow me to escort you to dinner at the hotel tomorrow evening as a token of my appreciation?" The invitation caught Katherine off guard. Dining with an unmarried man would certainly set tongues wagging in the small community. And yet the prospect was undeniably appealing. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your recovery time." "It would be no imposition," he assured her. "In fact, it would be a welcome distraction from—" He gestured vaguely toward the mine in the distance. Katherine hesitated, torn between propriety and her own desires. "I'm not certain Mrs. Holloway would approve of my dining out with a gentleman." "Ah," his expression fell slightly. "Of course, I should have considered that." "Perhaps another time when, however," Katherine interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I believe I could make an exception, given the circumstances." The smile that spread across his face transformed his features, softening the hard lines and bringing warmth to his visible eye. 7 o'clock then? I can call for you at the boarding house." 7 would be perfect, she agreed, a flutter of anticipation stirring in her chest. As Parker departed and the children returned for afternoon lessons, Katherine found herself wondering what she had just agreed to. It was merely a dinner to express gratitude, she told herself. Nothing improper or forward about it, yet she couldn't deny the quickening of her pulse when she thought about spending an evening in Parker Blackburn's company. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Katherine found herself distracted during lessons, her mind wandering to what she would wear that evening and what topics of conversation might arise. By the time she returned to the boarding house to prepare, her nerves were strung tight as piano wire. Mrs. Holloway's reaction to her dinner plans was predictably disapproving. A single lady dining with a gentleman to whom she is neither engaged nor related is highly irregular, Miss Jones. I had understood you to be a woman of proper upbringing. It is merely a gesture of thanks for my assistance during the mine accident, Katherine explained, trying to keep her tone even. Mr. Blackburn is the mine foreman, a respected position in the community. There is nothing improper about the arrangement. The older woman sniffed skeptically, but made no further comment as Katherine retreated to her room to change. Her wardrobe, practical for teaching, offered limited options for evening wear. She finally selected her best dress, a deep blue silk that her mother had insisted she bring for social occasions. At precisely 7 o'clock, Parker arrived at the boarding house. Katherine descended the stairs to find him standing in the small parlor, hat in hand, engaged in stiff conversation with Mrs. Holloway. He looked up as she entered, and the appreciation in his gaze sent warmth flooding through her. "Miss Jones," he greeted her, his voice low, "you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn." She noted that he had exchanged his work clothes for a clean shirt and jacket, though the bandage remained over his left eye. "Shall we go?" Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat pointedly. "I expect you back by 9 o'clock, Miss Jones. This establishment has rules." "Yes, Mrs. Holloway," Katherine agreed, suppressing a flicker of irritation at being treated like one of her young pupils. Outside, the evening air was cool and clear, the first stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Parker offered his arm, which Katherine accepted after only a moment's hesitation. "I apologize for Mrs. Holloway," she said as they walked. "She takes her role as guardian of propriety very seriously." "No need to apologize," Parker assured her. "She's right to be concerned." A mining town isn't always the safest place for a young woman alone. "I'm hardly alone at the moment," Katherine pointed out, earning a chuckle from her companion. The Silver Reef Hotel was the finest establishment in town, which wasn't saying much by Boston standards, but Katherine found its rustic charm appealing. The dining room was busy but not crowded, with several tables occupied by what appeared to be mine owners and businessmen. Parker led her to a corner table and held her chair, displaying manners that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. A waiter approached immediately, deferential in his address to the mine foreman. "Evening, Mr. Blackburn. What can I get for you and the lady?" "We'll have the roast beef," Parker decided after a brief glance at the chalkboard menu, "and a bottle of wine if you have something decent." Katherine raised an eyebrow at his presumption in ordering for her, but said nothing as the waiter departed. She was learning that ways in the West were different, less rigid in some respects while adhering to their own peculiar code of conduct in others. "How is your eye?" she asked once they were settled with glasses of surprisingly good red wine. Parker's hand rose automatically to the bandage. "Healing, according to the doctor. Still can't see much out of it, but he says that should improve." "That's good news," Katherine said sincerely. "And the mine, will it reopen soon?" A shadow crossed his face. "Tomorrow, the owners are pushing to resume operations as quickly as possible. Silver doesn't mine itself, and there are quotas to meet. So soon after such a tragedy," Katherine couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. "Surely the men deserve time to mourn their colleagues." "They do," Parker agreed grimly, "but mining doesn't wait for grief. The men need the work and the company needs the silver." He took a drink of his wine. "I've insisted on new safety measures, at least. Better quality timber, more frequent inspections. It won't bring back Michaels or Rodriguez, but it might prevent more deaths." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as their food arrived. Katherine found herself sharing stories of her teaching experiences, both in Boston and Silver Reef, while Parker spoke of his journey from Pennsylvania coal country to the silver mines of Utah. "My father was a miner," he told her. "Died of black lung before I was 15. I swore I'd never go underground, but it turns out there aren't many options for a boy with strong arms and limited schooling." "Yet you've risen to foreman," Katherine observed. "That speaks to abilities beyond mere strength." Parker shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I can read and figure well enough, and I have a knack for knowing when a tunnel is sound or when it's likely to cave in. Useful skills in a mine. Very useful indeed, especially to the men whose lives depend on such judgments, Katherine said, then hesitated before adding, they're fortunate to have you looking out for them. Not fortunate enough, he replied, his expression darkening. If I'd checked those support beams more carefully, 5 men would still be alive. Katherine reached across the table impulsively, placing her hand over his. You can't blame yourself for accidents, Mr. Blackburn. From what I heard, you saved many more lives than were lost. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, his blue eye intense. Parker, he said quietly, if we're sharing a meal and confidences, you might as well use my given name. Parker, she repeated, finding she liked the way it felt on her lips. And you may call me Katherine, though only when Mrs. Holloway isn't present to hear such impropriety. That drew a genuine laugh from him, transforming his features once again. Katherine found herself wondering how he would look with both eyes visible, his face unmarked by injury or the weight of responsibility that seemed to hang on him. Their conversation continued through the meal, ranging from books they had read, few in Parker's case, though he expressed interest in Katherine's favorites, to their impressions of Silver Reef and its inhabitants. Katherine was surprised by how comfortable she felt in his company, how easily they moved from topic to topic. All too soon, the hour grew late, and Katherine reluctantly mentioned the need to return to the boarding house before Mrs. Holloway sent out a search party. Parker paid the bill and offered his arm again for the walk back. The streets were quieter now, though light and music spilled from the saloons they passed. Katherine was acutely aware of Parker's solid presence beside her, the warmth of his arm under her hand. Thank you for a lovely evening, she said as they approached the boarding house. It was a welcome change from my usual routine. The pleasure was mine, Parker replied, stopping at the bottom of the steps. Perhaps we could do it again sometime, Katherine knew she should decline. Whatever this feeling was between them, it could lead nowhere proper. She was a schoolteacher, expected to maintain irreproachable standards of behavior. He was a miner, living in a cabin outside town, a man with a dangerous profession and limited prospects. And yet, I would like that, she heard herself say. Parker's smile in response was worth whatever gossip might follow. He bowed slightly, taking her hand and pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and thrillingly intimate. Good night, Katherine, he said softly. Good night, Parker. She watched him walk away before entering the boarding house, her heart lighter than it had been since her arrival in Silver Reef. The next morning brought Katherine back to her classroom, though her thoughts continually strayed to the previous evening. She found herself wondering if Parker had returned to the mine as planned, if his eye was healing properly, if he too was thinking of their dinner together. The answer to at least one question came at midday, when Parker appeared at the schoolhouse door just as the children were filing out for their lunch break. He looked tired, dust already clinging to his clothes, the bandage over his eye slightly askew. Miss Jones, he greeted her formally, aware of the curious glances from departing students. Mr. Blackburn, she returned, equally proper. What brings you here? I was passing by, he said, though the mine was in the opposite direction from the school. Thought I'd check if you needed anything, supplies for the classroom, perhaps. It was a thin excuse, but Katherine appreciated the gesture. That's very thoughtful. We're always in need of slate pencils and paper. I'll see what I can do, he promised, then lowered his voice. And I wondered if you might be free to walk with me on Sunday afternoon. There's a place up in the hills I think you might enjoy seeing. Sunday was the one day Katherine had entirely to herself, free from both teaching duties and Mrs. Holloway's watchful eye as the landlady attended church and then visited friends until evening. I believe I could arrange that, she agreed, matching his quiet tone. Where shall we meet? The big cottonwood tree at the edge of town, he suggested. 1 o'clock, I'll be there. A small smile touched his lips before he nodded and departed, leaving Katherine to wonder what she was getting herself into. This was no longer a simple dinner to express gratitude. This was something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her common sense waver. The days until Sunday passed with painful slowness. Katherine threw herself into her teaching, introducing her older students to Shakespeare and watching with satisfaction as they gradually warmed to the unfamiliar language. She avoided Mrs. Holloway's probing questions about whether she had heard again from that mine foreman, and wrote a carefully edited letter to her parents describing the scenery and her pupils, but omitting any mention of Parker Blackburn. Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect early autumn day. Katherine dressed in her most practical skirt and a simple blouse, adding a shawl and a wide-brimmed hat for protection from the sun. She left the boarding house immediately after the midday meal, claiming a desire to sketch the landscape, an interest she had mentioned to Mrs. Holloway previously. Parker was waiting at the cottonwood tree, his tall figure easy to spot even from a distance. He had removed the bandage from his eye, revealing a healing gash that ran from eyebrow to cheekbone. The eye itself opened only partially, the eyelid still swollen, but Katherine was relieved to see it intact. "You came," he said as she approached, as though he had half expected her to change her mind. "Of course," she replied. "I said I would." He offered her a canteen of water and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought some provisions. It's not a long walk, but the air up there can make you thirsty." The path led away from town and up into the red rock hills that surrounded Silver Reef. Parker set a pace that was challenging but not difficult for Katherine, occasionally offering a hand over rougher sections of the trail. They talked as they walked, their conversation flowing as easily as it had during dinner. "How is the mine?" Katherine asked as they paused for a rest in the shade of an overhanging rock. "Operational," Parker replied grimly. "The men are nervous, working more carefully than before, which is good, but the owners are pushing for increased production to make up for the days lost after the accident." "That seems callous," Katherine observed, accepting the canteen he offered. "It's business," he said with a shrug that didn't quite disguise his own feelings on the matter. "Silver is what built Silver Reef, and it's what keeps it going. Without the mines, this would just be another stretch of desert." They continued upward, the path growing steeper until suddenly it opened onto a small plateau. Katherine gasped at the view that spread before them, the town below, looking like a child's toy village, surrounded by the dramatic red and orange landscape that stretched to distant blue mountains. "It's breathtaking," she said, moving to the edge of the plateau where a flat rock offered a natural seat. "I come here to think," Parker told her, settling beside her, "to remind myself that there's more to the world than what's under the ground." They sat in companionable silence for a time, sharing the bread and cheese Parker had brought. Katherine found herself stealing glances at his profile, studying the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun brought out hints of gold in his brown hair. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said suddenly, turning to face her, his expression serious. "I'm not the kind of man a lady like you should be associating with." "And what kind of man is that?" Katherine challenged, a miner, uneducated, scarred. His hand rose to his injured eye. "With nothing to offer a woman from your background." "I'm not looking away," Katherine said firmly. "And I believe I'm capable of deciding for myself who I should or shouldn't associate with." Parker's visible eye searched her face, looking for something doubt, perhaps, or confirmation. Whatever he saw there made him reach out slowly, giving her ample time to move away and cup her cheek in his calloused hand. "Katherine," he said, her name almost a question. Instead of answering, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them until their lips met. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then more certain as Parker's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. When they parted, Katherine's heart was racing, her breath coming faster than the climb had caused. Parker rested his forehead against hers, his eye closed. "I've wanted to do that since I saw you at the mine that day," he confessed. "Covered in dirt and blood and still the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Katherine laughed softly. "Hardly my most flattering moment." "It showed me who you really are," he disagreed. Not just a proper Boston schoolteacher, but a woman of courage and compassion. They stayed on the plateau until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, talking, sharing more kisses, and gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Parker spoke of his childhood in a Pennsylvania mining town, the death of his father, and his journey west seeking better opportunities. Katherine told him of her stifling upbringing, her parents' expectations, and her decision to take the teaching position in Silver Reef as an act of rebellion as much as adventure. "Will you go back?" Parker asked as they reluctantly began the descent back to town, "when your contract is fulfilled?" Katherine considered the question. 2 months ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. Now she wasn't so sure. "I don't know," she admitted. "There's nothing really drawing me back to Boston except duty." "And duty is a powerful force," Parker noted, helping her over a difficult section of the path. "It is," she agreed, "but perhaps not as powerful as other forces." The look he gave her was full of hope and uncertainty, emotions she felt mirrored in her own heart. What future could there be for them? A schoolteacher and a miner from worlds so different they might as well be separate countries. And yet the connection between them felt too significant to dismiss. As they reached the outskirts of town, Parker stopped, turning to face her. "I don't want to cause problems for you," he said seriously, "if people see us together like this." "I know," Katherine sighed. "Silver Reef thrives on gossip almost as much as Silver." "I should let you go back alone," he decided reluctantly, "but may I see you again?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation, "though we'll need to be discreet." They arranged to meet again the following Sunday, then parted with a final, lingering kiss that Katherine felt down to her toes. She walked back to the boarding house in a daze, her mind and heart at war over the wisdom of what she was beginning. Mrs. Holloway was waiting in the parlor when Katherine arrived, her expression suggesting she had been watching the clock. "You were gone quite some time, Miss Jones." "I was beginning to worry. The light was so beautiful I lost track of time," Katherine explained, grateful she had thought to bring her small sketching pad, which now contained a hasty drawing of the view from the plateau. She showed it to Mrs. Holloway as evidence of her artistic endeavors. The older woman seemed mollified, though her sharp eyes noted Katherine's flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "You should be careful wandering alone in the hills, my dear. All manner of unsavory characters pass through mining towns." "I was perfectly safe," Katherine assured her, thinking of Parker's protective presence. "But I appreciate your concern." Over the next few weeks, Katherine and Parker developed a pattern of secret meetings Sunday afternoons in the hills, brief encounters on the road between the mine and town, and once, daringly, an evening at Parker's cabin when Mrs. Holloway was away visiting her sister in a neighboring settlement. The cabin was simple but neat, a single room with a bed, a table and chairs, a small stove, and shelves lined with practical items, and a few books that Katherine was surprised to discover. "My mother taught me to read," Parker explained when he caught her examining the small collection. "She believed education was the way out of the mines. She'd be pleased to know I'm keeping company with a schoolteacher." "Would she?" Katherine asked softly, uncertain how his family would view a relationship that crossed such clear social boundaries. "She wanted me to be happy," Parker said, drawing Katherine into his arms, "and you make me happy." Their kisses that night grew more passionate, hands exploring with increasing boldness, until Parker reluctantly pulled away, his breathing ragged. "If we don't stop now," he warned, resting his forehead against hers, "I might not be able to." Katherine's heart pounded at the implication. She knew she should step back, maintain the propriety her position demanded. Instead, she raised a hand to his face, tracing the scar that now marked his left eye, which had healed enough to open fully, though the vision in it remained somewhat impaired. "Perhaps I don't want you to stop," she whispered. Parker studied her face intently. "Are you certain?" "I don't want you to regret anything." In answer, Katherine kissed him again, pouring all her feelings into the gesture. That night in Parker's narrow bed, they crossed a line that Katherine had never imagined transgressing outside of marriage. Yet as they moved together, learning each other's bodies with tender exploration, She felt no shame, only a deep certainty that this connection was right, whatever society might say. Afterward, lying in Parker's arms as the fire in the small stove burned low, Katherine allowed herself to imagine a future with this man, a home they would build together. Children with his blue eyes and her love of books. A life far different from what she had been raised to expect, but infinitely more appealing. Reality intruded with the first light of dawn, reminding Katherine that she needed to return to town before her absence was noted. Parker walked with her partway, reluctant to let her go. "What are we doing, Katherine?" he asked as they paused for a final embrace at the edge of town. "Where does this lead?" It was a question she had been avoiding, knowing that any practical consideration of their situation would reveal its impossibility. A schoolteacher was expected to be above reproach, a model of virtue for her students. If her relationship with Parker became known, she would almost certainly lose her position, and if her parents learned of it, the scandal would devastate them. "I don't know," she admitted, pressing her face against his chest. "I only know I'm not ready to give you up." He held her tighter, his chin resting on top of her head. "Nor I you, but I have nothing to offer you, Katherine. No position, no wealth, just a miner's uncertain future." "That's not true," she countered, looking up at him. "You offer me yourself, which is worth more than any position or wealth." The smile that spread across his face warmed her heart. "Then we'll find a way," he promised. "Somehow." Katherine returned to the boarding house and slipped into her room undetected, her body pleasantly tired, her mind full of Parker. She had just enough time to wash and change before breakfast, appearing at the table with what she hoped was a suitably composed expression. The following weeks brought increased joy and increasing complications. Katherine found herself living a double life, the respectable schoolteacher by day and Parker's lover whenever they could steal time together. The deception weighed on her, particularly when facing her young students, who looked to her as a moral example. Parker, too, seemed troubled by their situation, though he never suggested ending it. "You deserve better than sneaking around," he told her one Sunday as they lay together in a secluded spot in the hills. "Better than a man who can only see you in secret. And what do you deserve?" Katherine asked, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Don't you deserve happiness too?" "My happiness is right here," he said simply, drawing her down for a kiss that effectively ended the conversation, but the issue couldn't be avoided indefinitely. As autumn deepened toward winter, Katherine received a letter from her parents, expressing concern over her extended absence, and mentioning that Professor Whitcomb, the colleague they had selected as her future husband, continued to inquire after her. The letter included a clear expectation that she would return to Boston in the spring when her teaching contract ended. Katherine showed the letter to Parker during one of their Sunday meetings, watching his face carefully as he read it. "Professor Whitcomb," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You never mentioned him before." "There was nothing to mention," Katherine replied. "He's a colleague of my father's, 52 years old, widowed with grown children. My parents decided we would suit before I even left Boston." "And would you?" Parker asked, folding the letter and returning it to her. "Suit, I mean," Katherine shook her head emphatically. "Not in any way that matters. He wants a housekeeper and hostess for his academic gatherings, not a wife in any true sense." "While I can offer you a miner's cabin and the disapproval of everyone you know," Parker said bitterly. "Hardly a fair comparison." "Stop it," Katherine said sharply. "I'm not comparing you to anyone. I'm here, aren't I? I've chosen you, haven't I?" Parker's expression softened and he reached for her hand. "You have, though I still can't quite believe it, but Katherine, we can't go on like this forever. People are already talking." It was true. Katherine had noticed the speculative glances, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way Mrs. Holloway had begun to watch her more closely. Silver Reef was too small a community for their relationship to remain secret for long, despite their precautions. "I know," she admitted. "But what alternatives do we have?" Parker took a deep breath as though gathering courage. "We could marry," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper, "if you would consider it." Katherine's heart leaped at the words, even as her practical mind noted all the obstacles. "Parker, are you proposing to me?" "Doing a poor job of it, apparently," he said with a self-deprecating smile. Then, more seriously, "I love you, Katherine. I think I've loved you since that day at the mine when you refused to be frightened off by blood and injury. I know I have nothing to recommend me as a husband except that love, but if it's enough for you, I would be honored to call you my wife." Tears sprang to Catherine's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "It's more than enough," she assured him, her voice choked with emotion, "and I love you too. So much that it terrifies me sometimes." Parker's face lit with hope. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Katherine confirmed, laughing through her tears. "Though heaven knows what we'll do or where we'll live or how we'll manage." "We'll figure it all out," Parker promised, gathering her into his arms. Together. They decided to marry quietly with only a few witnesses before the winter set in fully. Katherine would finish her teaching contract, living at the boarding house until the school year ended, to maintain at least a semblance of propriety. Meanwhile, Parker would work on expanding his cabin, adding a second room to make it more suitable for a couple. Of course, their plans required some immediate adjustments to their current circumstances. Once they had decided to marry, both felt it important to observe traditional proprieties until the ceremony. Their meetings became fewer and more circumspect, limited to walks in public places and occasional chaperoned visits at the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway watched them like a hawk after Katherine had nervously informed her of their engagement. The landlady's reaction had been predictably disapproving. "A minor, Miss Jones, with your education and background, I cannot imagine what your parents will say." "They will likely be shocked and disappointed," Katherine acknowledged. "But Mr. Blackburn is a good man, respected in his profession, and we care deeply for each other." Mrs. Holloway sniffed skeptically. "Romantic notions are all very well for novels, my dear, but real life requires practical considerations. How will you live? What will you do when he is injured again, or worse? The mines are no place for a man with a family to support." These were questions Katherine had asked herself repeatedly, yet her resolve remained firm. "We will face those challenges as they come together," she told Mrs. Holloway. "And I did not come west seeking safety or luxury." Writing to her parents proved even more difficult. Katherine composed and discarded a dozen drafts before finally sending a letter that stated her intentions clearly but lovingly, explaining her feelings for Parker and her decision to make her life in Silver Reef. She included no request for their blessing, knowing it would not be forthcoming, but expressed hope that they would eventually come to understand and accept her choice. The response, when it arrived weeks later, was as painful as she had anticipated. Her father wrote of disappointment and disbelief, her mother of heartbreak and social embarrassment. They urged her to reconsider, to return to Boston where her momentary infatuation with frontier life could be forgotten and her reputation salvaged. Katherine read the letter with tears streaming down her face, then showed it to Parker when he came to call that evening. His expression darkened as he read, his jaw tightening at the dismissive way her parents referred to him as "this minor you've apparently developed feelings for." "Perhaps they're right," he said quietly, returning the letter. "Perhaps you should go back. You could still have the life you were meant for." "This is the life I'm meant for," Katherine insisted, taking his hands in hers. "With you. My parents will either accept that eventually or they won't, but their disapproval changes nothing about how I feel." Parker's expression softened, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I will spend my life trying to prove worthy of you," he promised. "You already are," she assured him, leaning forward to kiss him briefly, mindful of Mrs. Holloway's watchful presence in the next room. Despite the difficulties, preparations for their simple wedding proceeded. Katherine sewed a new dress of deep blue wool, Mrs. Holloway grudgingly agreed to host a small reception at the boarding house, and Parker, with the help of several fellow miners, worked on expanding his cabin whenever he wasn't at the mine. December arrived with a dusting of snow and increasing excitement among Katherine's students as Christmas approached. She had organized a small pageant to be performed for the town, with the children reciting poems and singing carols they had practiced for weeks. The event was scheduled for the evening before the school closed for the holiday break, just 3 days before Katherine and Parker's wedding. The schoolhouse was packed with parents and townspeople on the night of the pageant, the room warmed by a roaring fire in the stove and decorated with paper chains and pine boughs the children had gathered. Katherine stood proudly at the back as her students performed, her heart full at the progress they had made under her tutelage. Parker arrived late, slipping in just as the final carol began. Katherine saw him standing by the door, still in his work clothes, his face showing the fatigue of a long day at the mine but his eyes warm as they met hers across the room. She smiled, a private greeting between them, before turning her attention back to the children. After the performance, as parents congratulated their children and enjoyed the simple refreshments that had been provided, Parker made his way to Katherine's side. "They did wonderfully," he said, his voice low. "You should be proud." "I am," she agreed, resisting the urge to straighten his collar or brush the cold dust from his sleeve. "Though I'm sorry you had to rush here straight from work." "New vein," he explained. "The owners want it assessed immediately. I'll likely be working longer hours until it's mapped properly." Katherine nodded, understanding the demands of his position but disappointed nonetheless. They had seen less of each other recently as wedding preparations consumed her free time and increased work at the mine occupied his. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. "I'll try," he promised. "But if not, definitely on Sunday. I have something to show you at the cabin." Sunday was to be their wedding day, a fact known to only a few close friends so far. The ceremony would be held at the small church in town, followed by a simple reception at the boarding house. "I look forward to it," Katherine said, her voice warm with double meaning. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of final preparations. Katherine packed her belongings, wrote lesson plans for the substitute teacher who would take over her class until a permanent replacement could be found, and tried to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach whenever she thought about the impending change in her life. Parker sent a note on Saturday apologizing for his continued absence. The new vein had proven more complex than initially thought, requiring his constant attention. But he assured her he would be waiting at the church on Sunday, counting the minutes until you become my wife. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting long shadows across the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Katherine dressed carefully in her new blue dress, arranged her hair simply but elegantly, and pinned a small bunch of dried wildflowers Parker had given her to her bodice. Mrs. Holloway, who had gradually warmed to the idea of the marriage after seeing Parker's consistent devotion to Katherine, helped with the buttons and declared her a lovely bride, if an unconventional one. Dr. Lewis had agreed to escort Katherine to the church, taking the place of the father who had refused to attend. As they walked through town, several people stopped to stare or call out congratulations, the news of the wedding having spread despite their attempts at discretion. The small church was already half filled when they arrived, mostly with miners and their families who had come to support Parker. Katherine scanned the faces anxiously, but didn't see her groom among them. "He's probably waiting in the back with the minister, Doctor." Lewis assured her, patting her hand. Tradition and all that. But as the minutes ticked by and the appointed hour came and went, a sense of unease began to spread through the congregation. The minister appeared from a side room, his expression concerned, and approached Katherine where she waited in the vestibule. "Miss Jones," he said quietly, "I'm afraid Mr. Blackburn has not yet arrived. Perhaps there has been some delay." A cold fear gripped Katherine's heart. Parker would never be late for their wedding unless something was terribly wrong. "Has anyone come from the mine?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Before the minister could answer, the church door burst open, admitting a breathless young boy, one of the mine owner's sons. Katherine recognized with increasing dread. "There's been a cave-in," the boy announced to the room at large. "At the Christie mine, they're saying it's bad, real bad." The church erupted in chaos, miners rushing for the door, women calling questions, children crying in confusion. Katherine stood frozen for a moment, then gathered her skirts and pushed through the crowd, following the miners who were already running toward the mine. The scene at the Christie was one of controlled panic. Men were being organized into rescue teams, equipment was being gathered, and the mine owner, Mr. Christie himself, was shouting orders from the entrance. Katherine pushed her way forward, ignoring the stares her wedding attire attracted. "Mr. Christie," she called, reaching the man's side. "Parker Blackburn is he." Christie's face fell at the sight of her. "Miss Jones, you shouldn't be here. This is no place for is he down there," Katherine interrupted, past caring about propriety. The mine owner hesitated, then nodded grimly. "He was inspecting the new vein with 3 others when it happened. We haven't been able to establish contact yet." Katherine's legs threatened to give way beneath her, but she forced herself to remain upright. "What can I do to help?" For the next several hours, Katherine worked alongside the miners' wives, preparing food and coffee for the rescue teams, tearing sheets for bandages, and praying with a fervor she hadn't known herself capable of. The blue dress that was to have been her wedding gown became smeared with dirt and soot, but she hardly noticed. Night fell, and still there was no word from below. The rescue teams reported difficult conditions. The cave-in had blocked the main access to the new vein, and they were having to dig through solid rock to create an alternate path. "It could be days," one exhausted miner told Katherine as she handed him a cup of coffee. "And even then." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone knew that the longer men were trapped underground, the less likely their survival became. Katherine refused to leave the mine site, even when Mrs. Holloway arrived with a warm coat and entreaties to come back to the boarding house. "I'll stay," she insisted. "He would do the same for me." The night stretched endlessly, punctuated by shouts from the mine entrance as rescue teams rotated, updates were shared, and occasional grim news emerged. One of the trapped miners had been found dead, crushed by falling rock. The other 3, including Parker, remained unaccounted for. Dawn broke over a scene of exhausted determination. The town had rallied, bringing food, blankets, and additional hands to assist the rescue effort. Katherine moved mechanically among them, her face pale but composed, offering what comfort and assistance she could while her heart screamed in silent agony. It was midday when a shout from the mine entrance galvanized everyone to attention. "We've broken through," someone yelled. "We need the doctor." Dr. Lewis, who had been dozing nearby, jerked awake and rushed forward, his medical bag in hand. Katherine followed on his heels, heedless of the hands that tried to hold her back. The waiting was excruciating. Men emerged from the mine entrance carrying an injured miner Katherine didn't recognize. Then another, unconscious but alive according to the quick assessment of the doctor's assistant. And then, "Parker," Katherine whispered, seeing the familiar form being supported between 2 rescuers. He was barely recognizable, his face and clothes coated in coal dust, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. But he was upright, conscious, his eyes searching the crowd until they found her. With a strangled cry, Katherine rushed forward, reaching him just as his legs gave out. "Easy," one of the rescuers cautioned as Katherine helped lower Parker to a sitting position on a nearby crate. "He's been through hell down there." Parker's hand found hers, gripping it with surprising strength. "Katherine," he rasped, his voice hoarse from dust and thirst. "I'm sorry about the wedding." A laugh that was half sob escaped her. "The wedding can wait," she assured him. "You're alive, that's all that matters." Dr. Lewis appeared, gently but firmly moving Katherine aside to examine Parker's injuries. "Laceration to the forehead, possible concussion, dehydration," he muttered. "But no obvious fractures or crush injuries. You're a lucky man, Blackburn." "The others?" Parker asked, wincing as the doctor probed his wound. "Jensen didn't make it," Dr. Lewis said grimly. "Alvarez and Thomas are alive but in rough shape." Parker closed his eyes briefly, grief etched in the lines of his face. Then he looked at Katherine again, reaching for her hand. "Some husband I'm turning out to be. You're not a husband yet," she reminded him, squeezing his fingers. "But you will be, as soon as you're well enough to stand at the altar without falling over." That drew a weak smile from him. I'd marry you right now if the minister was willing. He's over by the first aid tent, Dr. Lewis remarked casually as he bandaged Parker's head. Just saying. Katherine and Parker exchanged a look, hope kindling in both their eyes. Are you serious? Parker asked the doctor. Dead serious, Dr. Lewis confirmed. You two have waited long enough and we could all use something to celebrate after this nightmare. He turned to Katherine. What do you say, Miss Jones? Ready to become Mrs. Blackburn right here and now? Yes, she said without hesitation, if Parker is truly up to it. Wild horses couldn't stop me, Parker assured her, struggling to his feet with the doctor's assistance. Word spread quickly, and a crowd gathered around the first aid tent as the minister, still wearing the same clothes from the interrupted church service, took his position before them. Katherine, her blue dress ruined and her hair falling from its careful arrangement, had never felt more beautiful as she stood beside Parker, who leaned on her slightly for support but whose eyes shone with love and determination. Dearly beloved, the minister began, his voice carrying over the unusual gathering, we are assembled here in the sight of God and this community to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional words taking on new significance against the backdrop of the mine that had nearly claimed Parker's life. When they exchanged vows to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, Katherine felt the full weight of the commitment they were making and embraced it wholeheartedly. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister concluded. You may kiss the bride. Parker cupped her face gently, his bandaged hands leaving smudges of coal dust on her cheeks, and kissed her with tender reverence. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, the celebration a defiant response to the tragedy they had narrowly avoided. Mrs. Blackburn, Parker murmured against her lips, his smile tired but genuine. I like the sound of that. So do I, Katherine agreed, supporting him as they turned to face their well-wishers. Though I think your first duty as my husband is to let the doctor take you somewhere you can rest properly. Always the practical one, he teased, but didn't resist as doctor. Lewis stepped forward to guide them both toward a waiting wagon. Their first days of marriage were hardly conventional. Parker was confined to bed in Katherine's room at the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway had reluctantly allowed him to stay while he recovered. Katherine split her time between nursing her husband, completing her teaching duties as the term came to an end, and overseeing the final preparations for their cabin. News of their unorthodox wedding had reached Boston, adding a terse postscript to the already disapproving letters from Katherine's parents. But among the citizens of Silver Reef, their story had become something of a legend, the schoolteacher and the mine foreman who had married in the shadow of disaster, a symbol of hope and resilience for the entire community. By Christmas, Parker was well enough to move about with the aid of a walking stick, and they celebrated the holiday in their newly expanded cabin. It was simple but comfortable, with the second room Parker had added serving as a small parlor and kitchen, while the original cabin space became their bedroom. A fire roared in the stove, and pine branches adorned the windowsills, filling the air with their fresh scent. It's not much, Parker acknowledged as they sat together after a simple but satisfying Christmas dinner. Not what you're used to, it's perfect, Katherine assured him, curled against his side on the small sofa he had constructed himself. It's ours. As winter deepened, they settled into the rhythms of married life. Parker returned to the mine, though in a new capacity. The owners, recognizing his expertise and the respect he commanded among the miners, had promoted him to safety inspector for all their operations in the area. The position came with slightly better pay and, more importantly, reduced time underground. Katherine, having fulfilled her teaching contract, considered what to do next. The school board had expressed interest in rehiring her, married status notwithstanding, but she found herself drawn to a different path. I've been thinking, she told Parker one evening as they sat reading by lamplight, another of their simple domestic pleasures, about opening a small library for the town. Nothing elaborate, just a place where people could borrow books, and perhaps where I could offer reading lessons for adults who never had the opportunity to learn. Parker looked up from his newspaper, his expression thoughtful. That's a fine idea. This town could use more books and more readers, he grinned. And who better to run such an establishment than a former schoolteacher with a professor for a father? Katherine laughed, but her eyes were serious. Would you mind? It wouldn't bring in much income, at least not at first. Katherine, Parker said, setting aside his paper to take her hands. I didn't marry you expecting you to sit idle while I worked. You have a gift for teaching, for bringing books and ideas to life for people. If that's what you want to do, then I support you completely. With her husband's encouragement and a small loan from the bank, Katherine began to assemble what would become the Silver Reef Lending Library. She wrote to contacts in Boston, former colleagues, her father's students, even Professor Whitcomb, who proved surprisingly supportive of her venture, requesting donations of books suitable for a frontier town. Parker built shelves and reading tables in the evenings, and by spring, they had converted an unused storeroom behind the general store into a small but inviting space filled with nearly 200 volumes. The library quickly became a community gathering place, especially popular on rainy days, and during the brutal summer heat when its thick walls provided welcome relief. Katherine offered reading lessons 3 evenings a week and found herself particularly moved by the progress of the adult learners, many of them minors who had never before had educational opportunities. As summer turned to autumn, Katherine made another discovery that would change their lives yet again. Her monthly courses had stopped, and the occasional nausea she experienced in the mornings could no longer be attributed to something she had eaten. She shared her suspicion with Parker one evening as they walked home from the library, his arm around her waist, the stars brilliant in the clear desert sky. A baby, he repeated, stopping in his tracks to stare at her in wonder. You're certain, Doctor? Lewis confirmed it today, Katherine said, a mixture of excitement and apprehension in her voice. He estimates the baby will come in early spring. Parker let out a whoop that echoed off the surrounding hills, then caught himself, glancing around sheepishly before gathering Katherine in a gentle embrace. A baby, he marveled, his hand moving tentatively to rest against her still flat stomach. Our baby. The months that followed were filled with preparations and plans. The bedroom was rearranged to accommodate a cradle, which Parker crafted from pine with painstaking care. Katherine sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her mind full of questions and dreams about the child they would soon welcome. Her parents, who had maintained a chilly correspondence since her marriage, thawed slightly at the news of a grandchild on the way. Her mother sent a package containing baby clothes and a christening gown that had been in the family for generations, a tentative olive branch that brought tears to Katherine's eyes. The winter was harsh that year, snow piling high around their cabin, but inside was warmth and anticipation. Katherine continued to run the library, though she reduced her hours as her pregnancy progressed. Parker was attentive and protective, insisting on accompanying her to and from town in bad weather and enlisting neighbors to check on her when his work took him to more distant mines. Spring arrived with the first wildflowers just beginning to bloom when Katherine's labor began, earlier than expected. Parker, away inspecting a mine in a neighboring settlement, had left clear instructions with everyone in town to send for him immediately if there was any sign of the baby's arrival. Dr. Lewis arrived promptly, as did Mrs. Holloway and several other women who had become Katherine's friends over the past year. The labor was difficult and prolonged, the baby stubbornly positioned in a way that caused Katherine intense back pain with each contraction. You're doing wonderfully, Doctor. Lewis encouraged her as the hours stretched on. The baby is strong, I can hear the heartbeat clearly. Katherine nodded through gritted teeth, too focused on the work of bringing her child into the world to speak. She had sent away the messenger to find Parker hours ago, but there was no sign of him yet, and she prayed he would arrive in time to meet their child. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, Katherine's efforts intensified. "I can see the head," Dr. Lewis announced. "Just a few more pushes, Katherine." With a final, tremendous effort, Katherine felt the baby slip from her body, followed immediately by a lusty cry that filled the small room. "A boy," Dr. Lewis proclaimed, lifting the infant for her to see. "A fine, healthy boy." Tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down Katherine's face as the doctor placed the swaddled newborn in her arms. He had a shock of dark hair like Parker's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, she caught a glimpse of what she thought might be blue. "Hello, little one," she whispered, counting his fingers and toes with wonder. "We've been waiting for you." It was in this tableau that Parker found them, bursting through the door with snow melting in his hair, his face wild with anxiety until he saw Katherine sitting up in bed, their son cradled in her arms. "You made it," Katherine said, her voice weak but joyful. "Come meet your son." Parker approached the bed as though in a dream, sinking to his knees beside it to gaze in awe at the tiny face peering out from the blankets. "He's perfect," he breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "Just like his mother." "I was thinking we could name him William," Katherine suggested. "After your father." Parker's eyes, which had never fully healed from the injury that first brought them together, filled with tears. "William," he repeated. "William James Blackburn, I like the sound of that." The years that followed brought changes to Silver Reef. The silver veins began to play out, and the population gradually declined as miners moved on to new strikes elsewhere. But the town persisted, diversifying its economy with farming and commerce to support those who remained. Parker, with his expanded knowledge of mine safety and operations, became a consultant for mining companies throughout the territory. His expertise increasingly sought after as the industry faced new challenges and regulations. The position required occasional travel but provided a stable income and, importantly, kept him above ground most of the time. Katherine's library flourished, expanding its collection and its role in the community. When William was old enough for school, she resumed teaching part-time, focusing particularly on adult education. To her surprise and secret delight, she received a letter from her father praising an article she had written for an education journal about literacy programs in frontier communities. William grew into a curious, energetic boy with his father's love of the outdoors and his mother's passion for books. By the time he was 8, he had a sister, Elizabeth, whose arrival had been considerably less dramatic than his own, and whose sweet nature and quick mind endeared her to everyone she met. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their now expanded home watching the sunset paint the red rocks in ever deeper hues, William asked the question they had known would eventually come. "Pa, how did you get the scar on your eye?" Parker glanced at Katherine, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It was a mining accident, son. A support beam gave way and I caught a face full of splinters." "Did it hurt?" Elizabeth asked from her perch on Katherine's lap. "It did," Parker acknowledged. "But something good came of it too." "What?" both children asked in unison. "It's how I met your mother," Parker explained. "She helped patch me up after the accident." William looked skeptical. "That doesn't sound very romantic," Katherine laughed. "Romance comes in many forms, William. Sometimes it's flowers and poetry, but sometimes it's finding someone brave enough to face life's challenges alongside you." "Tell us the whole story," Elizabeth pleaded. "Please, Mama." Katherine and Parker exchanged a look, years of shared history passing between them in an instant. "Well," Katherine began, settling more comfortably in her chair. "It was 1879, and I had just arrived in Silver Reef to be the new schoolteacher." As she recounted their story for their children, carefully editing certain parts for young ears, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance meeting during a tragedy to the life they had built together, every step had been worth taking. When she reached the part about their first conversation after the accident, Parker picked up the thread. "I told your mother she shouldn't look at me with my face all cut up and my eyes swollen shut. Not a pretty sight, I assure you. But Mama looked anyway." Elizabeth guessed, always quick to follow a story. "She certainly did," Parker confirmed, reaching over to take Katherine's hand. She said, "I'm not looking away," and she never has, not once in all these years. "And I never will," Katherine promised, her heart full as she gazed at the family they had created together, a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she first stepped off the stage in Silver Reef all those years ago. In the distance, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, but on their porch, surrounded by love, there was only warmth and light.